At the turn of the 20th century, New York City was already the beating heart of American industry. Ships filled its harbors, immigrants poured through Ellis Island, steel, money, and ambition rose into the sky in the form of early skyscrapers. But there was one great inconvenience. If you were traveling to New York from the west or south by train, you couldn't actually arrive in Manhattan. The mighty Pennsylvania Railroad, one of the most powerful companies in America, could only take passengers as far as New Jersey. From there, travelers had to board ferries across the Hudson River to reach Manhattan. Winter winds cut across the water, summer heat clung like wet cloth, luggage was hauled, coats were buttoned tighter, and business leaders, politicians, and families alike all suffered the same annoyance. The president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, Alexander Cassatt, decided that was no longer acceptable. He didn't just want tracks into Manhattan, he wanted something grand, something eternal, a gateway worthy of the greatest city in the New World. And so began one of the boldest engineering projects in American history, tunnels driven under the Hudson River and the East River, and at their heart, a station so magnificent that stepping into it would feel like entering a Roman temple. Cassatt chose the architectural firm McKim, Mead and White, led by Charles Follen McKim, a man obsessed with classical beauty. McKim believed architecture should make citizens feel elevated, dignified, inspired. If New York was the modern Rome, then Penn Station would be its forum, its monumental civic stage. Construction began in 1904. What rose from the mud of Manhattan was not just a building, it was a statement. Old Penn Station opened in 1910, but its soul belonged to another age. From the outside, the building stretched across 2 city blocks, a massive classical facade lined with soaring Corinthian columns, carved stone ornaments, and enormous arched windows. The pink-hued granite seemed to glow at sunrise and smolder at dusk. To walk toward it was to feel yourself becoming very small, yet somehow very significant, as if the building was saying, "Your journey matters, your presence matters, travel is something noble." Inside, the main waiting room took people's breath away. It was inspired by the baths of Caracalla in ancient Rome, and it looked like a cathedral built for motion rather than worship. The ceiling vaulted nearly 150 feet into the air. Light streamed in through skylights framed in iron. Dust motes drifted lazily through the beams like tiny planets in orbit. The walls were clad in creamy travertine. Enormous statues watched silently over the scene. People didn't rush here, not at first. They lingered, they stared up. They understood they had stepped inside a masterpiece. Beyond the waiting room was the concourse, a breathtaking forest of glass and steel. Here, the engineering of the industrial age met the grace of classical architecture. Iron arches formed a delicate cage of ribs and beams, and above them stretched vast panes of glass. Sunlight spilled everywhere, onto newsstands, wooden benches, polished floors, and the moving river of travelers. The trains themselves were below, reached by elegant stairways that descended like streams into a valley. You could see the steam rise. You could hear the whistles and the echo of conductors calling destinations that sounded like promises. Chicago, St. Louis, Washington, Philadelphia. For decades, Penn Station thrived. Picture a morning in the 1920s. A businessman in a dark wool suit rushes toward track 7, briefcase swinging, the brim of his hat pulled low. A young couple stands near a column, hands intertwined, whispering goodbyes they'll remember forever. Children press their noses against the railings to watch the shining locomotives glide in like mythical beasts. Newspapers rustle. Porters call out politely. A violin case, a soldier's duffel bag, a wedding dress carefully folded into a suitcase, all pass under the same soaring roof. At Christmas, wreaths hung from the iron railings. In summer, light poured into the concourse until the whole space seemed to shimmer. Penn Station handled millions of passengers a year, not just the wealthy, but ordinary people too. And that was part of its magic. It was a palace built for everyone. Immigrants arriving from Ellis Island would sometimes make their first American train journey here. Newlyweds would begin their honeymoon here. Parents wept here as sons went to war and screamed with joy when they came home. This was a building with memory in its bones. Photographers adored it. Painters tried to capture its light. Writers described it as if it were alive. And in truth, it pulsed with the rhythm of the age: steam, steel, footsteps, voices in a dozen accents all mingling under that high glass sky. But history is rarely kind for long, and new dreams were rising on the horizon, made of concrete highways and airplanes. After World War II, America changed. Cars became affordable. Highways cut across the nation like rivers of asphalt. Air travel, once exotic, became faster and more common. The romance of train travel began to fade, and so did the profits of the great railroads. The Pennsylvania Railroad, once unimaginably powerful, started to feel the pressure. Penn Station, enormous and expensive to maintain, now seemed to some executives like a burden rather than a jewel. Its marble needed cleaning. Its ironwork needed care. Its vast cathedral-like spaces, which had once symbolized possibility, now symbolized cost. And cities in the mid-20th century were looking forward, not back. Glass towers, parking garages, modernity. The idea of demolishing Penn Station was not announced with trumpets. It crept in quietly through boardrooms and financial reports. The plan seemed brutally simple: sell the air rights, build a new Madison Square Garden above the tracks, bury the station beneath it. The public barely noticed at first. Architecture was not yet something people believed needed protection. Buildings seemed eternal until suddenly they weren't. But a small group of architects, historians, artists, and ordinary New Yorkers began to understand what was about to be lost. They pleaded, they protested, they wrote furious editorials. Yet, it was not enough. And so, the unthinkable happened. In 1963, the demolition began. Imagine watching that glass roof, once luminous, once the proud crown of the city, shattered by wrecking balls. Marble statues were hauled away like rubble. Columns that had stood like guardians for over half a century were smashed piece by piece. One journalist wrote that it felt like watching a civilization tear down its own cathedrals. Citizens walked past the site in stunned silence. Some cried, some shook their heads. Some only realized what they had lost when it was too late, when the wind blew through the empty shell of the great waiting room and the light was gone forever. Where there had once been space and dignity and beauty, there would now be a low-ceilinged, windowless labyrinth, a station beneath an arena beneath an office block, functional, efficient, and utterly without soul. But old Penn Station did not die quietly. Its destruction woke something up in America. People finally understood that beauty is not guaranteed to survive. It must be defended. The outcry helped lead to the creation of stronger landmark preservation laws in New York City. And just a few years later, when Grand Central Terminal was threatened with the same fate, it was saved. In a way, Penn Station gave its life so others could live. And even today, when travelers step through the cramped passages of the modern station and feel, without always knowing why, that something is missing, they are walking through the ghost of the old one. A palace of glass and stone that once stood proudly in the heart of Manhattan. A reminder that cities do not just build their future. They carry their past, or they lose part of themselves. It's early, maybe 7 a.m., sometime in the 1920s. The city is already awake, but inside Pennsylvania Station the morning feels calmer, almost dignified. Light filters through the glass roof like liquid gold. The iron beams overhead catch the glow and hold it, warming the cavernous concourse. Dust floats lazily in the air, turning in circles like tiny planets suspended in orbit. You hear footsteps before you see faces. Heels click crisply against polished stone. Leather shoes thud with quiet confidence. Suitcases glide across the floor, their worn edges whispering stories of journeys already taken. A newspaper boy threads through the crowd, his arms full of headlines, shouting about Wall Street numbers, distant politics, new inventions, and movie stars whose smiles shine from black and white photographs. His voice rises like a bird's cry beneath the high steel canopy. A train sighs somewhere below, a deep, steady breath of steam. A whistle pierces the air. Conversations pause for a heartbeat, then resume. Nothing about this place feels small. Even the most ordinary commuter, a clerk, a secretary, a traveling salesman, walks a little taller here, as if the grandness of the building lends them a bit of its own dignity. Because Penn Station wasn't just a terminal. It was a stage, and every traveler was an actor stepping into motion. If you stand long enough near the railings overlooking the platforms, you begin to notice patterns. A young woman in a carefully pressed dress clutches a letter in her hand. She reads it over and over, lips moving silently. She's waiting for someone she loves or someone she fears. It's impossible to tell. But the station knows. It has seen that expression 1,000 times. A soldier in uniform stands beside his mother. His cap sits slightly crooked. She keeps straightening it, then stopping herself, then doing it again. She wants to look strong for him, but every time the whistle blows, her eyes betray her. A porter carries his bag with quiet respect. Nearby, 2 businessmen argue about contracts and shipping costs and future deals, their words sharp and quick. But even they, mid-argument, glance up from their briefcases and marvel at the light above them. It's hard not to. And there are children. Always children. They run in circles around the column bases, their laughter bouncing against marble walls. They stare through the railings down at the trains like they're watching dragons sleep. For them, Penn Station isn't architecture, it's magic. It is a world that smells faintly of coal smoke, leather, newspaper ink, and coffee. A world where strangers brush shoulders and share glances and then disappear forever down distant tracks. Penn Station holds all these moments, the first hellos, the last goodbyes, the long-awaited returns, and keeps moving, always moving, like a great heart beating beneath the city. Stand still and listen. You'll hear the rhythm of the age, the soft murmurs of conversation layered beneath the crackling voice of the announcer echoing across the hall, the steady hiss of steam, the clanking shock of metal on metal as couplings tighten, the rattle of rolling luggage, the crisp flutter of ticket stubs torn cleanly in half. It's an orchestra, and everyone knows their cue. Porters glide through the crowds, practiced and confident. Their uniforms are spotless, their manners impeccable. They call passengers "sir" and "ma'am," lifting heavy trunks as if they were light as feathers. They know the station like a labyrinth they were born inside. Clerks stand behind polished counters, stamping tickets, answering questions, guiding lost travelers with patient smiles. The information board overhead clatters and shuffles, letters flipping into place like dominoes, each city name a promise: Baltimore, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Chicago. Sometimes the great doors swing open and a gust of wind sweeps in from the street, carrying with it the sound of vendors, taxicabs, and the heartbeat of New York itself. But inside, the atmosphere remains strangely serene, a calm center inside a storm-driven city. And always, above it all, the glass roof watches silently, letting the sky spill onto the travelers below. It is impossible to stand beneath that roof and not feel that you are part of something bigger than yourself. Then come the holidays. At Christmas, wreaths hang from iron railings and the waiting room glows with soft light. Families gather with arms full of gifts wrapped in colorful paper. Children stare up at the decorations as if they've been hung there by angels. The air buzzes with anticipation. You hear snatches of songs, of laughter, of stories shouted across the hall to relatives arriving from far-off towns. Soldiers home on leave are swallowed into embraces that look like they might never end. Tears fall. So does snow, outside, drifting against the stone facade while warmth spreads within. At Thanksgiving, crowds swell so large that the building seems to stretch just a little wider to hold them. In summer, the glass roof fills the concourse with brilliant sunlight. Women in light dresses and men in straw boater hats fan themselves as they wait. The city outside is hot, relentless, but down in the cool, shaded caverns of the station, the air carries the promise of ocean breezes or mountain winds. Every season has its mood, and Penn Station reflects them all. But perhaps the most haunting beauty comes at night. After the rush fades and the crowds thin, the great waiting room grows almost silent. Only a few travelers remain, a drowsy student, a night shift worker heading home, a lonely soul with nowhere else to go. The lamps cast long shadows across the stone floor. The echo of footsteps sounds larger, fuller, like ghosts walking with you. Somewhere below, a late train groans and begins to move, its engine breathing like a giant animal in the dark. You can stand alone in the middle of that hall and feel the past pressing gently around you. The thousands of lives that crossed this space, the laughter, the arguments, the grief, the hope. Penn Station at midnight feels eternal, as if it has always been here and always will be, as if nothing could ever erase it. What made Penn Station special wasn't just its beauty, though it was beautiful beyond doubt. It was that this beauty belonged to everyone. Unlike great opera houses or private mansions, Penn Station wasn't reserved for the wealthy or the elite. Immigrants arriving with almost nothing passed through its doors. Farm boys heading to the big city walked beneath its columns. Newlyweds, factory workers, salesmen, soldiers, famous actors, unknown dreamers, all entered the same great hall. They all looked up at the same sky-high ceiling and felt the same sensation: awe. Penn Station was a promise from a city to its people. You matter. Your journey matters. We built something grand because we believe your lives deserve grandeur. And that promise is what makes the story of its loss so powerful and so heartbreaking. But that part of the story comes later. For now, in these decades between 1910 and the mid-1940s, Penn Station stands at the height of its power, a living, breathing cathedral of travel, a masterpiece of human hands and human hope. And the trains keep coming, and the trains keep going. And life, countless lives, passes through its grand stone heart, how they tunneled under two rivers, the risks, the daring vision of Alexander Cassatt, and the incredible logistics that made Penn Station possible. Before there was beauty, there was a problem. The Hudson River, wide, dark, and stubborn, sat between Manhattan and New Jersey like a final barrier. Trains from the west could roar across mountains, valleys, and prairies, but when they reached the riverbank, they had to stop. Passengers climbed down, dragged their luggage onto ferries, and finished the journey by boat. In winter, icy winds slashed across the decks. In summer, the air was thick and breathless. The inconvenience was enormous, but everyone accepted it. Everyone except Alexander Johnston Cassatt, president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Cassatt wasn't a showman. He was an engineer at heart, patient, methodical, quietly visionary. And he believed that the future of his railroad, and perhaps the future of travel itself, depended on conquering that river. But tunneling under the Hudson wasn't just hard. Many experts believed it was impossible. The riverbed was unstable. The pressure at depth was deadly. Earlier attempts had ended in disaster, flooding tunnels, suffocating workers, and headlines that read like obituaries for progress itself. Yet, Cassatt refused to back down. He brought in the best minds in engineering. He studied European tunnels. He consulted with men who had buried railways beneath the streets of London. And slowly, deliberately, a plan began to take shape. They would build two sets of tunnels, under the Hudson River from New Jersey into Manhattan, and under the East River from Manhattan out toward Long Island. At the center of it all would stand a station unlike anything the world had ever seen. A station worthy of the journey. Work on the tunnels began in 1904. Imagine the scene. Massive machinery hauled to the riverbanks, compressors hissing, steel plates, iron rings, and timber sprawled like the bones of some giant mechanical creature. Hundreds of men, many of them immigrants chasing hope, lined up each morning to descend into the darkness. They dug under compressed air, inside pressurized chambers meant to hold the river at bay. The pressure was so intense that even small mistakes could be fatal. The air felt thick in the lungs. The sound of machinery echoed like thunder trapped inside a cave. And then there was the bends, decompression sickness. If a worker surfaced too quickly, nitrogen bubbles formed in the blood, causing agony, paralysis, or death. The men learned to climb slowly, carefully, respecting the invisible danger inside their own bodies. Yet, day after day, they returned. They carved their way forward inch by inch, pushing great iron shields ahead of them, lining the tunnels with steel rings as the river pressed down from above. Sometimes they struck pockets of soft mud that threatened to swallow them. Sometimes water burst through and sent workers scrambling for their lives. But the tunnels continued to grow, left tunnel, right tunnel, under one river and then under the other. Human determination slowly conquered geology. While men fought the river, another army of workers transformed Midtown Manhattan. Entire city blocks were cleared. Foundations were dug so deep they seemed to vanish into the earth. Steel rose like a forest. Granite followed. Walls were built not only for beauty, but for strength. Penn Station wasn't simply sitting on the city. It was woven into it. Below the surface, tracks branched like veins and arteries. Switches, signals, platforms, storage yards, all had to fit with absolute precision. Trains would glide underground, stopping beneath glass and iron skies without ever seeing daylight until arrival. It was an underground ballet of engineering, orchestrated by minds who saw not only what the city was, but what it could become. On November 27, 1910, the first passenger train crossed New Jersey, slipped beneath the Hudson River, and emerged into Manhattan without ever touching a ferry. Newspapers exploded with excitement. Crowds gathered to watch. Officials shook hands. Engineers, normally invisible heroes, stood silently to the side, their faces carrying both pride and exhaustion. They had risked their lives. Many had been injured. A few never returned home at all. But the dream had arrived. The impossible river was no longer a barrier. It was a tunnel. And standing above those tunnels was the Palace of Travel, the old Pennsylvania station, waiting to welcome the world. Architect Charles Follen McKim didn't want Penn Station to be merely functional. He wanted it to feel timeless, something that would still inspire awe 100 years later. He looked back to ancient Rome, to the great baths, basilicas, and temples, and asked a simple question. Why shouldn't ordinary travelers experience the same sense of grandeur that emperors once did? So he wrapped the steel skeleton in stone and marble. He gave the city colonnades like soldiers guarding the entrance. He crowned the concourse with iron ribs and glass wings, flooding the building with sky. And most important of all, he designed the journey. You entered through the stately facade, walked into the vast waiting room, descended toward the concourse where the light bent and shimmered, and finally reached the platforms where trains waited like creatures of iron breath. It was not an accident that you felt transformed along the way. McKim wanted you to. When Penn Station officially opened, critics and citizens alike understood immediately. This was not just a train terminal. It was a monument to American ambition. It stood for everything the early 20th century believed, that progress could be beautiful, that industry could coexist with art, that the future deserved to be wrapped in dignity. And for decades, it worked exactly as intended. Millions passed through, presidents, celebrities, soldiers, newlyweds, weary workers. Each of them became small beneath the ceiling and great because of it. But if there is a rule in history, it is this: great creations do not fall all at once. They fade, quietly, almost invisibly, until one day people look up and realize the lights have dimmed. And by then, it can be too late. By the middle of the 20th century, the grand palace of travel that was Pennsylvania Station was beginning to feel strangely out of place in its own city. The world was changing. People were buying cars. The interstate highway system unspooled across the country like fresh ribbons of possibility. Airplanes, once glamorous novelties, were becoming the future of long-distance travel. And the mighty Pennsylvania Railroad, which had once seemed invincible, began to see red numbers creeping across its balance sheets. Inside the iron-ribbed concourse, the daily rhythm of travel continued. The murmur of voices, the footsteps crossing marble floors polished by decades of movement, the persistent echo of announcements dissolving beneath the vaulted ceiling. But the station was expensive, breathtakingly expensive, to maintain. Silent cracks appeared not only in the stone, but in the railroad's faith that such magnificence still made sense. Executives sitting far from the cathedral-like halls built by their predecessors no longer saw a temple to democracy and travel. They saw an aging structure swallowing money. They saw land value. They saw air rights. They saw the future. And it wasn't marble and sunlight. A city that forgot to love. Its giant New York City itself was different now. Busier, harsher, more interested in modern efficiency than ancient grandeur. Glass and steel boxes were rising everywhere. Architecture was marching toward minimalism, toward cost-cutting, toward square lines and fluorescent lights. And so, whispers began. What if? What if the above-ground station, the great waiting rooms, the soaring concourse, the forest of Corinthian columns along 7th Avenue were simply removed? The tracks were deep underground. The trains would keep running. What if the air above those tracks could be sold? The plan sounded logical, clean, financially responsible. A new Madison Square Garden could be built on the site. Office towers could rise. Money at last would flow. And the station? Well, it would still exist, technically. Just hidden. Reduced to escalators and corridors buried beneath the streets. No sun, no sky, no soul. The day the giants fell. Demolition began in 1963. Imagine it, wrecking balls slamming into the pink granite exterior. Sculpted stone lions, once proud guardians of the portals of travel, torn apart and dumped like broken toys into the dark caverns of New Jersey landfills. The great concourse, once filled with steam-lit sunlight cascading through glass ceilings 6 stories above, was stripped bare. Glass shattered. Iron creaked and screamed as it was cut away, girder by girder. People watched. Some shook their heads. Some cried. Some shouted, but too late. Journalists described the scene with a kind of stunned grief. "We are destroying our own history," they wrote, as photographs captured the last rays of light filtering through a corpse of architecture that had once symbolized hope and modernity. It was not just the building being destroyed. It was the realization, the painful collective realization, that beauty was not guaranteed to survive. That progress did not always mean better, that a city could forget itself. Birth of a movement. But in tragedy, something else was born. Outrage hardened into purpose. Writers, architects, activists, ordinary citizens began to say, never again. If Penn Station could be lost, what else might be erased? Grand Central Terminal, historic neighborhoods, landmarks whose walls held the story of the nation. The demolition of Old Pennsylvania Station became a rallying cry, a scar that people refused to let heal quietly. And in that scar, the modern historic preservation movement in the United States took root. Laws were passed, protections established. A nation decided architecture mattered, not just as structures of utility, but as vessels of memory. Penn Station died. but in doing so, it saved countless others. A ghost that never left. And yet, the ghost remained. Every day, millions passed through the underground station that replaced the old one. They walked through low ceilings and crowded fluorescent corridors, unaware that above their heads there had once been sunlight you could practically breathe in. But some felt it. A sense that something magnificent had once lived here. A sense of absence. And over time, that absence became a story. One retold so often it became legend. Architects studied the old photographs with a mixture of awe and heartbreak. New Yorkers used Penn Station as shorthand not just for a place, but for a warning. This is what happens when you forget what beauty is worth. Echoes in the present. In recent years, parts of the story have found a quiet echo of redemption. The creation of Moynihan Train Hall inside the old Farley Post Office building, just across the street, brought back some of the light, some of the space, some of the dignity to rail travel in Manhattan. It is not the old Penn Station. Nothing ever will be. But it is a nod to what once was, and a promise not to forget again. And so, the story ends. But the memory doesn't. Old Pennsylvania Station was more than a building. It was a dream in stone and glass, a belief that travel should feel grand, that public spaces should be worthy of the people who moved through them, that a city should wear beauty proudly on its streets. And though its columns lie buried and its halls are gone, the lesson remains. What we build matters. What we protect matters more. And sometimes the ghosts of our greatest spaces whisper to us not to mourn them, but to listen.